Welcome to Totally Awesome Films, and in this video we're going to talk about the 1980 film Airplane.
The white zone is for immediate loading and unloading of passengers only. There is no stopping in the red zone.
You ever seen a grown man naked? Joey, you ever hang around the gymnasium? You like movies about gladiators?
Watching Airplane is an indescribable experience, a non-stop barrage of jokes and gags that just keeps hitting you with unrelenting, hilarious fury. In fact, according to the internet, Airplane has 178 jokes in its short 90-minute runtime. That's one joke every 30 seconds. But what makes this movie special is that all the jokes are laugh-out-loud funny. Every joke is a killer that lands, and that is totally awesome. But amidst the massive absurdism, we get actors like Peter Graves, Robert Stack, Lloyd Bridges, delivering ridiculous dialogue with a deadpan expression that takes the humor to another level. And at the heart of this film is a sweet, romantic, heartwarming story about a man trying to win back the love of his life. Everything about this film is so good. I remember first seeing this movie when it was first released on cable back in 1981, no doubt a few months after its incredible theater run. I was 11 years old and I remember absolutely loving this movie. As an 11-year-old, I probably didn't get more than a quarter of the jokes, but it was still hilarious and I was rolling in my living room laughing. Furthermore, it was a good movie. I cared about Ted Stryker and the passengers on the plane, and I wanted him to land the plane and get back together with Elaine. Over the course of the past 4.5 decades, Airplane has always been one of those infinitely rewatchable classics that I'll watch when I stumble on it on TV or stream when I see it listed on a site. It's sort of my comfort movie I'll watch when I have nothing to watch. And I even watched it 4 times just last year. It's such a great film. And as many times that I'd seen this movie, I only found out about 6 years ago that Airplane was a direct parody of an old black and white film called 0 Hour. The filmmakers have been very open about that fact, and I'm not kidding when I say it's a direct parody. The plot, the tone, the dialogue, the characters. Airplane is a direct remake of 0 Hour. 0 Hour with an exclamation point, and that's why the title of Airplane also has that exclamation point. In 0 Hour, the main protagonist is a man named Ted Stryker who cannot get over a command decision that killed his fighter squadron, and the guilt is ruining his marriage. He gets on a plane to chase his wife and save his marriage, but on this flight, everyone who ate fish becomes violently ill, including the pilot and co-pilot. A doctor convinces Ted Stryker to land the plane, which he does, earning the respect of his wife. See, I told you, it is practically word for word. This film was made by the Wisconsin comedy trio of brothers Jerry Zucker and David Zucker and their friend Jim Abrams, who are collectively known as Zucker, Abrams, Zucker, or Zaz. Now, David Zucker was born in 1947 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and his younger brother Jerry Zucker was born in 1950. Jim Abrams was born in 1944 in Shorewood, Wisconsin, and all three attended Shorewood High School, although at different times. And Jerry and David Zucker grew up with Jim Abrams. Their two families were friends and their parents would frequently have each other over for dinner. And so Jerry and David grew up playing with Jim, and the three used to always try to crack each other up and make each other laugh. And in 1971, they created a sketch comedy troupe called the Kentucky Fried Theater, where they would do live sketches making fun of commercials and TV shows that were on late-night TV. Originally, they wanted to be independent filmmakers, but they couldn't afford a camera. But their family friend gave them a video camera. But they used to make fake commercials that were making fun of the real commercials that were on TV at the time. And they had an idea to rent out a small theater and play them. They had a fourth friend who was part of an improv troupe, and the troupe also did live skits for those shows. One night at the beginning of the process, the four were at Bob's Big Boy restaurant late at night trying to come up with a name for their theater. And in the 1970s, Bob's Big Boy served Kentucky Fried Chicken. And one of the Zaz guys joked that the theater should be called Colonel Sanders's Kentucky Fried Theater. They laughed and then they realized that it was actually pretty good. And so that became the official name, Kentucky Fried Theater. The Kentucky Fried Theater became very successful, selling out their shows, and began to receive positive reviews from the local newspaper. It was so successful that they even traveled the country and had sold out shows in Los Angeles. And one of the things that Zaz loved about doing the Kentucky Fried Theater as a live show was that they were able to get immediate feedback on their jokes. Either the audience laughed and they knew they had a good joke, or they didn't, which meant the joke sucked. And after a few years of doing the theater, they had a very good idea what was funny and what wasn't. And they cite their years doing the Kentucky Fried Theater as honing their comedic skills. Well, how Zaz got their material is that they record chunks of TV shows from late night and then watch them for commercials where they would mine the humor for their comedy show. And sure enough, 0 Hour was one of the late night TV shows they happened to record. And while they were scanning the show for commercials, they became fascinated with this movie. Apparently, the movie was so ridiculous and unintentionally hilarious, made even more hilarious because the actors were taking everything so seriously, and they had to make fun of it. And so in 1974, they wrote a movie parody of this film. And they basically lifted the plot structure and dialogue while also making fun of a lot of elements in the movie. A YouTuber named Mason Wood, aka The Gookie, made this incredible compilation, and you can see how similar the two movies are. I remember seeing this about 6 or 7 years ago, and it blew my mind. And there are a lot of copies since then, but I hear he's the original, so I'm going to post a link to his webpage in the description. Now, the Zaz Trio cites their inexperience at writing a screenplay was the reason they copied, or let's just say borrowed, so directly from 0 Hour. However, Zaz worried that they had copied so much of 0 Hour that they were opening themselves up to a potential lawsuit. And while their lawyers assured them that their film would fall into the realm of parody, Zaz wasn't so sure, so they decided to play it safe. They went to Warner Brothers, who produced 0 Hour, and bought the entire rights of the movie from Warner Brothers for the bargain price of only $2,500. Remember, this was 1975. VHS, cable TV, and things like HBO were not yet prominent. There were no video rental stores, and there's certainly no internet in 1975. And certainly no streaming. So once a movie came out, if it got old, it was pretty much useless. So 0 Hour was worth $2,500 to Warner Brothers at that time. And so now in 1975, Zaz was ready to sell their movie, Airplane. Unfortunately, no studio was willing to buy it, and their friend, director John Landis, who had just directed the cult film Schlock, Landis convinced Zaz to make a movie out of their material from the Kentucky Fried Theater, which they turned into the 1977 film, The Kentucky Fried Movie, directed by John Landis. And I remember seeing the Kentucky Fried Movie in high school and thinking, hey, this reminds me of Airplane, not realizing that the two films were made by the same group of people. And while making their first movie, Zaz had an insight. If they wanted to get their film Airplane made in Hollywood, they would have to direct it themselves. Directors had a much greater chance of getting a movie made than the writers, and so Zaz began to pitch their new directing project, Airplane, across Hollywood, where it quickly gained attention as a very funny script. When Zaz met with producers at Paramount to pitch Airplane, they pitched it as Animal House on a plane. And while not totally true, Airplane was nothing like Animal House, but Zaz was already getting hip to how Hollywood worked and knew this was the best way to sell the movie to a bunch of Hollywood executives. And it worked. And as for the Animal House connection, Animal House was directed by their friend, John Landis, who had directed the Kentucky Fried Movie. Well, Paramount liked this idea and they bought the script. However, at the last moment, another studio called Avco came in and offered Zaz even more money than Paramount. However, after speaking with Jeff Katzenberg, Zaz decided to go with Paramount. And Zaz reports that they were very pleased with their decision to go with Paramount and was pleasantly surprised how much the studio took care of them, mentored them, and taught them about the screenwriting process. But Paramount had two conditions, two changes they wanted with the project. They wanted Airplane to be in color, not black and white as originally planned, and second, they did not want Airplane to take place on a small propeller plane like 0 Hour, but rather a huge modern jetliner. Paramount felt that this would make the story more relatable to a mass audience. And initially, Zaz pushed back, but President Michael Eisner basically said, you might be right, you may end up making a great movie, but it won't be with the studio. So take some time to think about it, and we'll discuss it Monday morning. And on Monday, Zaz agreed. Airplane was in production, and for years, Zaz continued to thank Michael Eisner for the suggestion to make it in color and to make it on a large jetliner. Now, in the original concept, they put in commercials similar to the Kentucky Fried Movie, but ultimately they decided to take it out. And that was a great choice because commercials would have dated the movie, whereas Airplane, as is, has a timeless quality to it. Because after all, Airplane wasn't just making fun of 0 Hour, it was also making fun of the whole airplane disaster movie genre. In the 1970s, there was a glut of airplane disaster films that was started by a 1970 movie called Airport. And it was such a huge success that it spawned a franchise and a whole movie genre. And Airport was written by Arthur Hailey, who only 20 years earlier earlier, wrote 0 Hour. The first Airport movie was released in 1970, starring Burt Lancaster, and was a huge success, both a critical and commercial hit that would earn 10 Academy Award nominations. Its sequel, Airport 1975, was a far less successful film, a cash grab, and the series would get progressively worse. 2 years later, they released a third film in the franchise, Airport 77, which was critically panned, followed 2 years later by the fourth film in the franchise, The Concorde, Airport 79. Well, this film, Airplane, effectively put the Airport film franchise out of its misery, since no Airport films were made after Airplane. Now, for the humor, Zaz had an idea to play everything completely straight, and the setup for the joke would be how straight it was played, and then at the last minute, defy expectations and do something completely ridiculous and pull the rug out from under the audience. Therefore, for the jokes to work, everything had to be played as seriously and as deadpan as possible. The characters in the movie cannot know that they're in a comedy. The more serious and straight they played it, the funnier it would be. Now, for the musical theme, they hired Elmer Bernstein. And Elmer Bernstein was one of those well-known music composers of the 1950s and 60s, and he composed the music to over 80 TV shows and 150 movies, including The Ten Commandments, The Magnificent Seven, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Great Escape, HUD, and John Wayne's True Grit. And most of them were serious movies, although he did score the 1978 Animal House and the 1979 Meatballs. And he wrote the music for this film to be very serious in the vein of those airplane disaster flicks, but added a little quirk that made it seem slightly off-kilter. And the music absolutely works for the movie, giving the film gravitas, lulling you into the seriousness of the scene, only to have the rug pulled out from under you when the joke lands. And from here, he would go on to score the 1980 Blues Brothers, the 1983 Trading Places, the 1984 Ghostbusters, and the 1986 Three Amigos, as well as many, many others. For casting, Zaz decided that it would be funny if they cast serious actors in the roles, actors that had never done comedy before and was only associated with serious dramatic performances. However, Paramount suggested comedians for the main roles, and they suggested Bill Murray or Chevy Chase for the role of Ted Stryker. Now, for the role of Dr. Rumack, they suggested Dom DeLuise. And this did make Zaz panic a little. However, this was actually a compliment by the studio. It suggested that they had such high confidence in their project that they were willing to offer these big stars. However, this being Zaz's first big Hollywood project, that's not how they took it at the time. So for the role of Captain Rex Kramer, they had Robert Stack in mind when writing the script. Because Zaz felt that Robert Stack's character, Elliot Ness in The Untouchables, was exactly the tone they wanted for the movie. They felt that if they can get Robert Stack, everything else would begin to fall into place. And Robert Stack wasn't interested at first, but Zaz continued to call him and beg, and after 2 weeks of calling every day, he finally agreed to do it. Mostly because he liked these three guys, but also thought the script was funny. During the filming of this movie, Robert Stack struggled with the performance, and this is because in real life, Robert Stack was nothing like his serious deadpan character, like characters like Elliot Ness. Because in real life, he was very pleasant and smiled and joked a lot. He was a very nice guy, and that's how he was playing Rex Mason for this comedy. Basically, he was acting and playing a character in a comedy. And he wasn't understanding that what Zaz wanted was this very serious deadpan delivery, as if his character didn't know that he was in a comedy. So David Zucker showed Stack a clip of comedian John Biner doing an impersonation of Robert Stack. And this worked. And this led to the incredible performance we saw on screen. So when we see Stack play Captain Rex Kramer, we're actually seeing Robert Stack of John Biner doing an impersonation of Robert Stack. Interestingly, Zaz actually wrote the main character of Ted Stryker with someone in mind. And that was their friend David Letterman. David Letterman was a local writer and comedian who had nabbed small parts in TV shows. And by 1978, he had already become Johnny Carson's favorite guest host for The Tonight Show. And when Zaz sold Airplane, they encouraged him to audition, which he did in 1979. Although if you watch this audition, it is clear that he's very uncomfortable during the audition. So a movie career was not in David Letterman's destiny. But a few months later, on June 23, 1980, David Letterman was given his own morning talk show called The David Letterman Show, which would go on to receive 2 Emmys, but was canceled for low ratings. But NBC had faith in David Letterman, so in February 1982, they reworked the show to nighttime as Late Night with David Letterman, and history was born. However, it's weird to think that if David Letterman was any better and got the role in Airplane, we may have never gotten Late Night with David Letterman. A year later, Zaz appeared on Late Night with David Letterman and played Letterman's audition for his late night audience. And it was hilarious. And David Letterman was genuinely terrible in the audition. But it's a great piece of Hollywood history preserved for us on the internet. Now, the Zaz trio knew that they had to nail the casting for the two leads, Ted Stryker and Elaine Dickinson. They knew that the romance between the two was the heart of the movie. And if their romance didn't work, the entire movie wouldn't work. And so for the role of Elaine Dickinson, many actresses auditioned, including Shelley Long, who would go on to play Diane Chambers in Cheers, and also Sigourney Weaver of Alien fame. The role ultimately went to Julie Haggerty. And Zaz knew that the second she walked through the door for the audition, she was perfect for the role. They loved the fact that she conveyed a genuine, innocent kindness. And there was no pretension, and they felt that she genuinely and wholeheartedly believed everything she was saying. The portrayal we see on screen is exactly who Julie Haggerty is in real life, and there was practically no acting. And Zaz was so happy to find her that when she walked out of the audition, they all cheered, because they had found their Elaine. And Julie Haggerty was born in 1955 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and at age 15, she started modeling and spent her summers in New York City making money by modeling, and then started acting in her brother's theater group. And in 1979, she made her off-Broadway debut in the play Mutual Benefit Life, and then was cast in the movie All That Jazz, although her part was eventually cut from the final print of the movie. She was then cast in this movie, Airplane, which was officially her first feature film, and this propelled her to movie star status. And she was great here, conveys a charming innocence and kindness that was perfect for the movie. And she would appear again in the sequel, Airplane 2. And while her movie career never quite reached the heights of the two Airplane movies, she continued to act throughout her career, starring in some notable roles like the mother in What About Bob and in Albert Brooks' Lost in America, Woody Allen's A Midsummer Night's Sex Comedy, and the recent A Christmas Story Christmas. Now for the role of the lead, Ted Stryker, after screen testing David Letterman, the Zaz trio were given a studio mandate to audition Bruce Jenner, right? The 1976 Olympic decathlon gold medal winner, who is now known as Caitlyn Jenner. And they say that he worked very hard to audition for the movie and was very eager to please both Zaz and the producers of Paramount. And after his first audition, he begged for a second audition, and then after the second audition, begged for a third audition. However, during that third audition, he also asked if he can read the part for Elaine. And Zaz thought it was strange at the time, in 1979, and they assumed that it was an acting exercise. However, they realized 30 years later that it was a sign that as early as 1979, and likely before, that Caitlyn Jenner was already exploring her own gender identity. And I think that is very interesting. So Zaz initially had a very difficult time casting the role. Then one day, they got a call from the heads of Paramount saying that the role of Ted Stryker had been cast and that the new actor was Barry Manilow. Yes, the Barry Manilow, the musician, the soft rock superstar. Barry Manilow. And when they heard this, Zaz laughed and they said, yeah, good one. You got us. That's, haha, I get it. And they assumed it was a brilliant joke. But it was not a joke. Apparently, Barry Manilow got a hold of the script, read it, and absolutely fell in love with it, and thought it was the funniest thing he had ever read. He got the joke of the movie, and Zaz said, finally, the first person to fully get the joke of the script, and he's completely wrong for the part. Fortunately, when Manilow's agent found out that the movie was going to be directed by 3 writers of the script who had no directorial experience, Manilow's agent convinced him to withdraw from the project. Then Zaz was given headshots of a sitcom actor named Robert Hayes, who was already starring as the husband on the sitcom Angie, which lasted for 2 seasons. Now, Robert Hayes was born in 1947 in Bethesda, Maryland, and had made a name for himself as a character actor. He's had hundreds of small roles, but is mostly known for his role in Angie and as Ted Stryker in Airplane 1 and 2. And after Airplane, he'll star in a handful of comedies like Take This Job and Shove It, and then go back to character work. And later in his career, he became a very prominent voice actor. And he voiced many projects, including the voice of Tony Stark's Iron Man in the Marvel animated movies. And so Zaz had their main leads. And the movie starts at the airport, namely the Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. And from the opening scene, you can hear the 2 announcers at the curbside of the terminal. The white zone is for loading and unloading of passengers only. There is no stopping in the red zone. And it feels like you've arrived at the airport. And they nailed that indescribable feeling of going to the airport. And they wanted the announcements to feel authentic. So the Zaz directors auditioned a bunch of professional voice actors to record that segment. And none of them were capturing the essence of that LAX curbside announcers. So the Zaz directors actually found the people who recorded that message for the Los Angeles International Airport, and hired them to do the segment. And here's something surreal. They were a married couple in real life, and apparently they got a real kick out of recording that dialogue. I also recognize the stewardess, Lorna Patterson, as the actress who played Private Judy Benjamin on the TV version of Private Benjamin. And I recognize the heart transplant patient as Judy Whalen from The Love Boat, where she played Captain Stubing's daughter, Vicky Stubing. And of course, I absolutely recognize the jive interpreter as Barbara Billingsley, the mother of Leave It to Beaver, June Cleaver. And the two men who speak jive? What a hilarious and brilliant moment. And apparently the idea for this scene came when the Zaz trio went and saw the 1971 film Shaft, starring Richard Roundtree as John Shaft, and Zaz could not understand the dialogue. So they had this idea of a jive language and thought it would be funny if they had a boring white guy who acted as an interpreter. The two actors who got the role as the guys who speak jive were Al White and Norman Gibbs. Both Al White and Norman Gibbs were working TV character actors who had bit roles here and there, but of course this would jumpstart both their careers. And since this film, Al White and Norman Gibbs has had bit roles in just about every TV show ever made. They were also friends who knew each other, and they auditioned together. And before the audition, they actually expanded the jive language from just a few lines to a whole dialogue. In the script, Zaz just wrote a couple of gibberish words, but Al White and Norman Gibbs understood the assignment that Zaz wanted and created an actual jive language. And Al White went and studied the 1972 book, Black English, Its History and Usage in the United States by J.L. Dillard, and the two of them really did create an entire jive language that we eventually saw on screen, with rules, syntax, and a natural flow. And when they performed this routine during their audition, Zaz totally cracked up and they were hired immediately. Now for the translator, they wanted someone who no one would expect, who was associated completely with a white middle-class suburban mother. They wanted the mother from The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, a woman named Harriet Nelson. Well, she was given the script and did not understand it and turned it down. So they asked the second most iconic white middle-class suburban mother, June Cleaver from Leave It to Beaver, actress Barbara Billingsley. And she too did not get the script, but fortunately her husband did. And he thought the script was hilarious and begged her to do it. And so she did. And Zaz were huge fans of Leave It to Beaver growing up. And when they first met Barbara Billingsley, they were in awe as if they were meeting their long-lost mother. Al White wrote the jive dialogue that Barbara Billingsley speaks and even helped her with the elocution and articulation of her dialogue. Also, Al White's mother was a huge fan of Leave It to Beaver, and Barbara Billingsley even spoke to Al White's mother, who was blown away to be able to speak to her idol. And Al White was very appreciative of that. And the two remained friends for many years after Airplane. And I think that is totally awesome. And Barbara Billingsley said that she had a great time on set and afterwards really enjoyed the newfound fame she got to a whole new generation. Barbara Billings' acting career had ended in the 1960s and she was comfortably in retirement for about 20 years. And she took the Airplane role at age 65 and did it just for fun. However, she saw a huge resurgence in her career, being hired for roles in Mork and Mindy, The Love Boat, The Match Game, and Hollywood Squares, Silver Spoons, Parker Lewis Can't Lose, Roseanne, and of course, the new Leave It to Beaver, where she revived her role as Grandma June Cleaver for 101 episodes over 4 seasons. In fact, she was in more acting jobs after Airplane than before, and she just had a blast with it. And she continued to act into her late 80s and passed away at the age of 94. As for poor Harriet Nelson, who turned down the role, she is said to have regretted it her entire life. Now, when the passengers get on the plane, they are served coffee, and one man asks for a second cup of coffee, and his wife is surprised and thinks, "That's odd. Jim never has a second cup of coffee at home." And this is a riff on an iconic commercial for U-Band coffee that played all the time when Airplane was out. And the joke is that the woman here is the same actress who played the wife in the very U-Band commercial, character actress Lee Bryant. And I'm watching it this time appreciating the rapid barrage of unrelenting jokes, and I'm appreciating how much story and drama they've managed to put in. And it helps because it not only gets us invested into these characters, but also gives time to allow for the jokes to breathe and pay off. And I think that makes the jokes funnier and more fun. And one of my favorite jokes comes when Ted Stryker sits next to an elderly lady and she gives him encouragement about their relationship, and Stryker begins to tell his life story. And I love the annoyed reaction the old lady gives herself, like, "Oh Lord, here he goes." And she is played by Ann Nelson, who will go on to play Mrs. Berg, the school secretary, in 112 episodes of Fame. And this flashback is so iconic, from the Girl Scouts who fight to the Staying Alive song that suddenly plays, and the whole seedy bar breaks out into a disco, and the absurdity of Elaine's dancing partner being stabbed while dancing. And then we go to a little boy who is given a tour of the cockpit, and the pilot, Captain Over, asks some very inappropriate questions. So inappropriate that apparently Peter Graves actually had a hard time saying the lines to the little kid, and afterwards he felt so embarrassed that he could not look the kid in the eye for the entire production of the movie. Now, the pilot is Peter Graves, who is also primarily known for his dramatic roles, and until this role was probably best known as Jim Phelps in the original TV series Mission Impossible, which played for 6 years from 1967 to 1973, and then for another 2 seasons in the revival series from 1988 to 1990. And apparently when Peter Graves received the Airplane script, he did not get it. He read a few lines and was disgusted and threw the script across the room. And while Joey is in the cockpit, this leads to a hilarious scene where Joey recognizes Roger Murdoch as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who loses his temper. And this is an awesome scene. And actually, this is a reference to the co-pilot in 0 Hour, who was a famous football player at the time, doing a cameo. In 0 Hour, he was played by Pro Bowl champion Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch, who was a halfback for the Los Angeles Rams from 1947 to 1957. And to parody this sports cameo, Zaz originally wanted Pete Rose, but Rose was in the middle of his baseball season, so they went with basketball Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And this scene pokes fun at all the athlete cameos in movies, and it's hilarious that this kid just calls out this trope. And just as the movie utilizes serious dramatic actors to poke fun at themselves, it was fortuitous that they got Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had a reputation as being a very serious basketball player, one that took his sport way too seriously. And this movie showed the world that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar actually had a sense of humor and could absolutely laugh at himself. And his cameo in this movie broke out Kareem Abdul-Jabbar from the celebrity of basketball and created a whole new fan base of people who love him for this role in this movie, and he would frequently get requests from fans who didn't know anything about basketball but loved his Roger Murdoch. And then when people begin to get sick, stewardess Elaine searches the plane for a doctor, and it is here we meet Leslie Nielsen. And he's going to completely steal this movie. Because up to this point, Leslie Nielsen also had only been in serious roles, but he is so great here, and his deadpan delivery is absolutely hilarious. Now, Leslie Nielsen was born in 1926 in Saskatchewan, Canada, and during World War II, he enlisted and served in the Royal Canadian Air Force. And after the war, he worked as a disc jockey and then moved to New York to pursue acting. And in 1950, he nabbed his first role opposite Charlton Heston. And Leslie Nielsen was a very prominent character actor and starred in over 100 TV shows and movies, including appearances in Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, Wagon Train, Gunsmoke, The Virginian, and The Wild Wild West. And he was in dozens of movies, but is best known for his role in The Forbidden Planet and in The Poseidon Adventure. And when Leslie Nielsen heard about this role in Airplane, he read the script and absolutely loved it. And he lobbied very hard to get it. And he even told his agent, I want to be in this, accept any offer. Don't tell them this, but I'm even willing to pay them to be in it. And while all of his Hollywood roles had been very serious, in real life, Leslie Nielsen had a strong sense of humor and was a very funny guy, and wanted to star in a comedy. And on the first day of line reading, they noticed that Leslie Nielsen was reading the lines with a comedian's wink wink. And that wasn't what Zaz wanted. So they gave him a videotape of 0 Hour and told him to watch it and study it, particularly the role of the doctor. And Nielsen did, and he got it. And the very next day, Nielsen began to read his lines in a very serious manner, with total sincerity. And that led to the brilliant and hilarious portrayal we saw on screen. And at 54, his deadpan role as Dr. Rumack in Airplane is going to change the trajectory of his career. He's going to really capitalize on his newfound image for comedy and transform his career into becoming one of the most prominent comic actors of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. He will star in another Zaz project as Frank Drebin in the TV series Police Squad, and while it didn't quite catch on at the time, it has gone on to become a cult classic. And of course we know that Police Squad eventually made it to the big screen as The Naked Gun from the Files of Police Squad. And that movie was a huge success, spawning the Naked Gun series. He'll go on to star in dozens of parody roles such as Repossessed, Dracula Dead and Loving It, Spy Hard, Wrongfully Accused, and the Scary Movie franchise. And his role here as Dr. Rumack will lead to some of the most iconic lines in the movie. Yes, I'm serious, and don't call me Shirley. And other iconic lines like, Captain, how soon can we land? I can't tell. You can tell me. I'm a doctor. And Leslie Nielsen had a great time on set making this movie, and apparently had a fart machine, which his friend made for him. And he would crack up the crew with fart noises and began selling the fart machines to other cast members. So in this movie, like 0 Hour, everyone on the plane who had fish gets violently sick, including the pilot who inflates, so they have to inflate the automatic pilot Otto. And Otto himself also steals the show. So we also get Lloyd Bridges as the other deadpan Captain McCroskey, who will slowly go from smoking to drinking to popping amphetamines. And just when you think it can't get any more absurd, McCroskey says the craziest line. It looks like I picked the wrong week to stop sniffing glue. In real life, Lloyd Bridges is the father of Jeff Bridges and Beau Bridges, and had been in over 100 movie roles throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, including the classic Western High Noon. And in the 1960s, he was the star of the TV show Sea Hunt, as well as The Lloyd Bridges Show, an anthology drama series. And in the 1970s, he featured prominently in the hit miniseries How the West Was Won and Roots, all very serious roles. And Lloyd Bridges is one of those actors I was introduced with this movie, so I always associated him as a comedian, which he wasn't. Because up to this point, he'd been a very serious, dramatic actor. But I am not alone, because in 1993, Jeff Bridges was cast in a 1994 film, Blown Away, and they were casting an actor to play his uncle. And Jeff recommended his father, Lloyd Bridges, for the role. And when they did, apparently the director said, "Lloyd Bridges, the comedian?" Well, Lloyd Bridges eventually got the role, but it's funny how much a person's image can change in a decade, all because of one movie. And since his iconic role here, he'll continue to star in more comedy roles, including Hot Shots and Mafia. And I also remember him from his recurring role in the TV sitcom Seinfeld, where he played the Crepe King, Izzy Mandelbaum. Another scene stealer is the outrageous Johnny as McCroskey's assistant, who is a comedic force of his own. And McCroskey asks, "How about a cup of coffee, Johnny?" He casually says, "No thanks." And there are lines like "the fog's getting thicker," and where Johnny jumps into frame and says, "and Leon's getting larger." And Johnny was played by Steven Zucker, who was a good friend of the Zaz Trio and one of the early members of the Kentucky Fried Theater. And back in those days, he was known for just letting loose during the show and could often have the entire audience cracking up for the entire show. And sometimes he could single-handedly save a dying show with his crazy improvised antics. He had a gifted sense of humor and absolutely had no fear. And the breakout star of the Kentucky Fried Theater, and the Zaz Trio just loved him. And in 1975, he moved to Hollywood and starred in the comedy Carnal Madness and the 1977 Cracking Up, and of course was in the Kentucky Fried Movie. And aside from the 2 or 3 lines that involved the plot and was actually in the script, Steven Zucker improvised all of his crazy hilarious lines. And of course, he would return again as Jacobs in Airplane 2.
And then the dinosaurs came, but they got too big and fat, so they all died and they turned into oil. And then the Arabs came and they bought Mercedes-Benzes.
Now McCroskey gets in touch with Rex Kramer, who has a history with Ted Stryker. He was Stryker's old commander during the war. And one of his iconic scenes is when he gets to the airport and religious cultists approach him for donations. He beats them up one by one. And apparently, Robert Stack, at the age of 60, did the entire scene by himself without the use of a stuntman. Robert Stack is another movie legend who had had a prominent career before this movie, but I learned about him from this film. And prior to Airplane, he had been in 40 films, but was best known as the crime-fighting Elliot Ness in the Prohibition drama, The Untouchables. And after this film, he'll star as the host of Unsolved Mysteries, where he remained host for 15 years. And another iconic Airplane joke is when the U-Bahn coffee lady begins to freak out and the stewardess shakes them, then Dr. Rumack slaps her.
I'll take care of this. Calm down.
Doctor, you're one on the phone. Everything's going to be
And it progresses to a line of people waiting to physically abuse her. Now, after hearing an inspiring story from Dr. Rumack, Ted Stryker decides to land the plane, and he earns the respect of Elaine. And while the plane is coming in for a landing, all of a sudden, all the power of the entire airport turns off, and it's Johnny who's mischievously pulled the single plug. Well, Ted Stryker lands the plane, he saves the lives of everyone on the plane, and he finally wins back the love and respect of Elaine. And the movie ends with Otto flying the plane and inflating a female companion. And made on a very modest budget of $3.5 million, it went on to earn $158 million. And that's nearly 50 times the production budget. And that's $600 million in today's money. That's a huge hit by any standard. and to this day it is considered a modern classic. Empire magazine ranks it as one of the 500 greatest movies ever made, and it ranks number 6 in Bravo's list of 100 funniest movies of all time. And in 2010, it was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. And of course, Airplane has become a cultural icon. And due to the success of this film, Zaz would be able to write their own ticket in Hollywood. Their next project would be The Police Squad in 1982, which despite excellent reviews, was canceled after 6 episodes. However, Police Squad would be revived in the big screen as The Naked Gun. Then in 1984, Zaz released their next film, a parody similar to Airplane, but making fun of the spy and war movies. And it was called Top Secret, featuring Val Kilmer in his first role, which I really liked, but at the time was a huge disappointment at the box office. And their next project was an interesting choice. It was the Danny DeVito and Bette Midler comedy, more grounded in reality, called Ruthless People. And it was a critical and commercial success, allowing Zaz to begin to write their own tickets in Hollywood. And they would each go in very different directions, and all 3 will have very successful Hollywood careers. David Zucker would go on to make the Naked Gun franchise, which started in 1988 and would lead to Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, and take over the Scary Movie franchise. Jim Abrams would create the similarly wacky Hot Shots franchise, which was to Top Gun and Rambo movies what Airplane was to airport disaster films. And the most interesting career trajectory goes to Jerry Zucker, who took a more serious directorial turn, and he directed the 1990 uber hit Ghost, starring Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore, and he would also direct The First Knight, the King Arthur movie starring Sean Connery as King Arthur and Richard Gere as Lancelot. And one of my favorite legacies of Airplane comes from Delta Airlines. Yes, the actual Delta Airlines. Because in 2014, Delta Airlines decided to make a cool, hip, new onboard safety video. You know, the one with the stewardess telling you where the exit lights are, how to use a seatbelt, and the oxygen masks. Well, there's been a trend in the past few years to make videos that are more fun and amusing. And I saw one video that was fully animated in a Japanese anime style. Just creative ways to make those videos. Well, Delta Airlines wins the award for the best onboard safety video. So the whole video is an homage to the 1980s. And it features passengers with wild 80s hair, day-glow clothing, people playing on the Atari on the plane, and one of the passengers is Alf. And the video ends where we go into the cockpit and the co-pilot is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar reprising his role as Roger Murdoch. And that is 100% awesome. So that ends my video on one of the funniest movies of all time. So tell me, what is your favorite joke in Airplane? Let me know in the comments below. And in the next video, we're going to talk about Airplane 2. So that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.